Hello, this is Morel Bernard with the continuation of the story, Styles, Poirot, Mysterious Affair at Styles. Last words were, I expressed my appreciation, and John took me into the house and up the broad staircase which forked right and left halfway to different wings of the building. My room was in the left wing and looked out over the park. Okay. And by the way, please subscribe to the channel, and please share the videos with others. John left me, and a few minutes later, I saw him from my window walking slowly across the grass, arm in arm with Cynthia Murdoch. I heard Mrs. Ingerthorpe call, "Cynthia," impatiently, and the girl started and ran back to the house. At the same moment, a man stepped out from the shadow of a tree and walked slowly in the same direction. He looked about 40, very dark, with a melancholy, clean-shaven face. Some violent emotion seemed to be mastering him. He looked up at my window as he passed, and I recognized him, though he had changed much in the 15 years that had elapsed since we last met. It was John's younger brother, Lawrence Cavendish. I wondered what it was that had brought that singular expression to his face. Then I dismissed him from my mind and returned to the contemplation of my own affairs. The evening passed pleasantly enough, and I dreamed that night of that enigmatical woman, Mary Cavendish. The next morning dawned bright and sunny, and I was full of the anticipation of a delightful visit. I did not see Mrs. Cavendish until lunchtime, when she volunteered to take me for a walk, and we spent a charming afternoon roaming in the woods, returning to the house about 5. As we entered the large hall, John beckoned us both into the smoking room. I saw at once by his face that something disturbing had occurred. We followed him in, and he shut the door after us. "Look here, Mary, there's a deuce of a mess. Evie had a row with Alfred Ingerthorpe, and she's off." "Evie off?" John nodded gloomily. "Yes, you see, she went to the mother, and here's Evie herself." Miss Howard entered. Her lips were set grimly together, and she carried a small suitcase. She looked excited and determined, and slightly on the defensive. At any rate, she burst out, "I've spoken my mind." "My dear Evelyn," cried Mrs. Cavendish, "this can't be true." Miss Howard nodded grimly. "True enough. Afraid I said some things to Emily she won't forget or forgive in a hurry. Don't mind if they've only sunk in a bit. Probably water off a duck's back, though. I said right out, 'You're an old woman, Emily, and there's no fool like an old fool.' The man's 20 years younger than you, and don't you fool yourself as to what he married you for. Money. Well, don't let him have too much of it. Farmer Rakes has got a very pretty young wife. Just ask your Alfred how much time he spends over there." She was very angry. Natural. I went on. "I'm going to warn you, whether you like it or not, that man would as soon murder you in your bed as look at you. He's a bad lot. You can say what you like to me, but remember what I've told you. He's a bad lot." What did she say? Miss Howard made an extremely expressive grimace. "Darling Alfred, dearest Alfred, wicked calumnies, wicked lies, wicked woman, to accuse her dear husband." The sooner I left her and the house, the better, so I'm off. But not now, this minute. For a moment we sat and stared at her. Finally, John Cavendish, finding his persuasions of no avail, went off to look up the trains. His wife followed him, murmuring something about persuading Mrs. Inglethorpe to think better of it. As she left the room, Miss Howard's face changed. She leant towards me eagerly. "Mr. Hastings, you're honest. I can trust you." I was a little startled. She laid her hand on my arm and sank her voice to a whisper. "Look after her, Mr. Hastings. My poor Emily. They're a lot of sharks, all of them. Oh, I know what I'm talking about. There isn't one of them that's not hard up and trying to get money out of her. I've protected her as much as I could. Now I'm out of the way. They'll impose upon her." "Of course, Miss Howard," I said. "I'll do everything I can. But I'm sure you're excited and overwrought." She interrupted me by slowly shaking her forefinger. "Young man, trust me. I've lived in the world rather longer than you have. All I ask you is to keep your eyes open. You'll see what I mean." The throb of the motor came through the open window, and Miss Howard rose and moved to the door. John's voice sounded outside. With her hand on the handle, she turned her head over her shoulders and beckoned to me. "Above all, Mr. Hastings, watch that devil, her husband." There was no time for more. Miss Howard was swallowed up in an eager chorus of protest and goodbyes. The Inglethorpes did not appear. As the motor drove away, Mrs. Cavendish suddenly detached herself from the group and moved across the drive to the lawn to meet a tall, bearded man who had been evidently making for the house. The colour rose in her cheeks as she held out her hand to him. "Who is that?" I asked sharply, for instinctively I distrusted the man. "That's Dr. Bornstein," said John shortly. "And who is Dr. Bornstein?" "He's staying in the village doing a rest cure after a bad nervous breakdown. He's a London specialist, a very clever man, one of the greatest living experts on poisons, I believe." "And he's a great friend of Mary's," put in Cynthia, "the irrepressible." John Cavendish frowned and changed the subject. "Come for a stroll, Hastings. This has been a most rotten business." She always had a rough tongue, but there is no stauncher friend in England than Evelyn Howard. He took the path through the plantation, and we walked down to the village through the woods which bordered one side of the estate. As we passed through one of the gates on our way home again, a pretty young woman of gypsy type, coming in the opposite direction, bowed and smiled. "That's a pretty girl," I remarked appreciatively. John's face hardened. "That is Mrs. Raikes." "The one that Miss Howard—" "Exactly," said John, with rather unnecessary abruptness. I thought of the white-haired old lady in the big house, and that vivid, wicked little face that had just smiled into ours, and a vague chill of foreboding crept over me. I brushed it aside. "Styles is really a glorious old place," I said to John. He nodded rather gloomily. "Yes, it's a fine property. It'll be mine some day. Should be mine now by rights if my father had only made a decent will. And then I shouldn't be so darn hard up as I am now." "Hard up, are you?" "My dear Hastings, I don't mind telling you that I'm at my wits' end for money." "Couldn't you borrow some from your brother?" "Lawrence? He's gone through every penny he ever had, publishing rotten verses in fancy bindings. No, We are an impecunious lot. My mother's always been awfully good to us, I must say. Well, that is up to now, since her marriage, of course." He broke off, frowning. For the first time, I felt that with Evelyn Howard, something indefinable had gone from the atmosphere. Her presence had spelled security. Now that security was removed and the air seemed rife with suspicion, the sinister face of Dr. Bornstein recurred to me unpleasantly. A vague suspicion of everyone and everything filled my mind. Just for a moment, I had a premonition of approaching evil. I had arrived at Styles on the 5th of July. I come now to the events of the 16th and 17th of that month. For the convenience of listeners, I will recapitulate the incidents of those days in as exact a manner as possible. They were elicited subsequently at the trial by a process of long and tedious cross-examinations. I received a letter from Evelyn Howard a couple of days after her departure, telling me she was working as a nurse at the big hospital in Middleham, a manufacturing town some 15 miles away, and begging me to let her know if Mrs. Inglethorpe should show any wish to be reconciled. The only fly in the ointment of my peaceful days was Mrs. Cavendish's extraordinary and, for my part, unaccountable preference for the society of Dr. Bornstein. What she saw in the man I cannot imagine, but she was always asking him up to the house and often went off for long expeditions with him. I must confess that I was quite unable to see his attraction. The 16th of July fell on a Monday. It was a day of turmoil. The famous bazaar had taken place on Saturday, and an entertainment in connection with the same charity at which Mrs. Inglethorpe was to recite a war poem was to be held that night. We were all busy during the morning arranging and decorating the hall in the village where it was to take place. We had a late lunch and spent the afternoon resting in the garden. I noticed that John's manner was somewhat unusual. He seemed very excited and restless. After tea, Mrs. Inglethorpe went to lie down to rest before her efforts in the evening, and I challenged Mary Cavendish to a single at tennis. About 7:15, Mrs. Inglethorpe called us that we should be late as supper was early that night. We had rather scrambled to get ready in time, and before the meal was over, the motor was waiting at the door. The entertainment was a great success, Mrs. Inglethorpe's recitation receiving tremendous applause. There were also some tableaux in which Cynthia took part. She did not return with us, having been asked to a supper party and to remain the night with some friends who had been acting with her in the tableau. The following morning, Mrs. Inglethorpe stayed in bed to breakfast, as she was rather overtired. But she appeared in her briskest mood about 12:30 and swept Lawrence and myself off to a luncheon party. Such a charming invitation from Mrs. Rowlandson, Lady Tadminister's sister, you know. The Rowlandstones came over with a conqueror, one of our oldest family. Mary had excused herself on the plea of an engagement with Dr. Bornstein. We had a pleasant luncheon, and as we drove away, Lawrence suggested that we should return by Tadminister, which was barely a mile out of our way, and pay a visit to Cynthia in her dispensary. Mrs. Inglethorpe replied that this was an excellent idea, but as she had several letters to write, she would drop us there, and we could come back with Cynthia in the pony trap. We were detained under suspicion by the hospital porter, until Cynthia appeared to vouch for us, looking very cool and sweet in a long white overall. She took us up to her sanctum and introduced us to her fellow dispenser, a rather awe-inspiring individual, whom Cynthia cheerily addressed as Nibs. "What a lot of bottles!" I exclaimed as my eye travelled round the small room. "Do you really know what's in them all?" "Oh, say something original," groaned Cynthia. "Every single person who comes up here says that. We are really thinking of bestowing a prize on the first individual who does not say, 'What a lot of bottles.' And I know the next thing you're going to say is, 'How many people have you poisoned?'" I pleaded guilty with a laugh. "If you people only knew how fatally easy it is to poison someone by mistake, you wouldn't joke about it. Come on, let's have tea. We've got all lots of secret stores in that cupboard." "No, Lawrence, that's a poison cupboard." "The big cupboard, that's right." We had a very cheery tea and assisted Cynthia to wash up afterwards. We had just put away the last teaspoon when a knock came at the door. The countenances of Cynthia and Nibs were suddenly petrified into a stern and forbidding expression. "Come in," said Cynthia in a sharp, professional tone. A young and rather scared-looking nurse appeared with a bottle which she preferred to Nibs, who waved her towards Cynthia with the somewhat enigmatical remark, "I'm not really here today." Cynthia took the bottle and examined it with the severity of a judge. "This should have been sent up this morning. Sister is very sorry, she forgot. Sister should read the rules outside the door." I gathered from the little nurse's expression that there was not the least likelihood of her having the hardihood to retell this message to the dreaded sister. "So now it can't be done until tomorrow," finished Cynthia. "Don't you think you could possibly let us have it tonight?" "Well," said Cynthia graciously, "we are very busy, but if we have time it shall be done." The little nurse withdrew, and Cynthia promptly took a jar from the shelf, refilled the bottle, and placed it on the table outside the door. I laughed. "Discipline must be maintained." "Exactly. Come out on our little back balcony. You can see all the outside wards there." I followed Cynthia and her friend, and they pointed out the different wards to me. Lawrence remained behind, but after a few moments Cynthia called to him over her shoulder to come and join us. Then she looked at her watch. "Nothing more to do, Nibs?" "No." "All right, then we can lock up and go." I had seen Lawrence in quite a different light that afternoon. Compared to John, he was an astoundingly difficult person to get to know. He was the opposite of his brother in almost every respect, being unusually shy and reserved. Yet he had a certain charm of manner, and I fancy that if one really knew him well, one could have a deep affection for him. I'd always fancied that his manner to Cynthia was rather constrained, and that she, on her side, was inclined to be shy of him. But they were both gay enough this afternoon, and chatted together like a couple of children. As we drove through the village, I remembered that I wanted some stamps, so accordingly we pulled up at the post office. As I came out again, I cannoned into a little man who was just entering. I drew aside and apologized, when suddenly, with a loud exclamation, he clasped me in his arms and kissed me warmly. "Mon ami Hastings," he cried. "It is indeed mon ami Hastings." "Poirot," I exclaimed. I turned to the pony trap. "This is a very pleasant meeting for me. Miss Cynthia, this is my old friend, Monsieur Poirot, whom I've not seen for years." "Oh, we know Monsieur Poirot," said Cynthia gaily, "but I had no idea he was a friend of yours." "Yes, indeed," said Poirot seriously. "I know Mademoiselle Cynthia. It is by the charity of that good Mrs. Inglethorpe that I'm here." Then, as I looked at him inquiringly, "Yes, my friend, she had kindly extended hospitality to 7 of my country people who alas are refugees from their native land. We Belgians will always remember her with gratitude." Poirot was an extraordinary-looking little man. He was hardly more than 5 feet 4 inches, but carried himself with great dignity. His head was exactly the shape of an egg, and he always perched it a little on one side. His moustache was very stiff and military. The neatness of his attire was almost incredible. I believe a speck of dust would have caused him more pain than a bullet wound. Yet this quaint, dandified little man, who I was sorry to see now limped badly, had been in his time one of the most celebrated members of the Belgian police. As a detective, his flair had been extraordinary, and he had achieved triumphs by unravelling some of the most baffling cases of the day. Oh, join me. Join me for the next video of Styles of Poirot. Join me for the next video of Poirot Styles. Agatha Christie with me, Morel Bernard. Join me for the next video. Look forward to seeing you then.